Hello and welcome to Funding with Trust, the podcast for people looking to have more impact in international development. I'm John Deeks, and together with my co-host Eve Omala, you're welcome. Funding with Trust brings you candid conversations with top grassroots leaders in philanthropy and the non-profit sector on why supporting grassroots organisations is important, what works and what doesn't, and best practices to help you make more impact in your philanthropic journey. Our goal is to create more genuine, trust-based and equitable partnerships between donors and African-led grassroots organisations. Welcome, Eve Omala.
Thank you, John. I'm looking forward to today's session. But before we dive in, I want to talk about a straightforward approach to international development. So, John, when you visit a new place,
yes,
who do you ask directions from?
Well, locals. They always know what's going on.
Exactly. But in development, funders tend to come with their own directions to new places and often wonder why they miss it. And I want to share a very quick story of something that happened in one of the communities in Africa. So some well-meaning Westerners came into this community and observed that women were walking about 3 kilometers to a well to fetch water. And they imagined that, you know what, maybe we should set up a borehole very close to their homes. That will solve the problem of them having to walk long distances. So they did set up a borehole. They mobilized funds, set up a borehole, but they did not talk to these women at all to find out what the actual issue was. When they set up the borehole, guess what? The women didn't use it. They continued to go to the well.
Why?
Exactly. So they were probing, they were like, why aren't they getting water from the borehole? Don't they know how to use a borehole? So they tried to train them. But again, the women continued to go to the well. And eventually, when they asked the women responded and said, well, this trip that we take to the well is our time to bond. We enjoy our time together. We get to be away from our husbands and we love it so much. But if you bring a borehole close to our homes, you take away our time. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, that grassroots organizations are best placed to address their own problems because they understand the realities. And that's what we are going to hear from our guests today.
Local knowledge, local understanding is king always.
Definitely.
Well, grassroots is what it's all about, Eve, of course, and that's why these podcasts have been created. So the best place, of course, is to address problems at the source. So let's talk to one of our source leaders. Who is our guest today?
Yeah, our guest today is Solomon King Benge, the founder of Fundi Bots. Fundi Bots is based in Uganda, and they are teaching African kids how to build robots, how to code and experiment with machines and gadgets as a means of improving their science curriculum knowledge, classroom performance, career training, and technical skills. And Fundi Bots' motto brings an environment of fun, of passion and purpose back into the classroom. I mean, learning should be fun, right?
Yes, of course, learning should be fun always. Now, as part of our podcast, alongside our guest each episode, we'll be highlighting the work of a number of outstanding grassroots organisations, Eve. Let's take a listen to our first one before catching up with Solomon from Fundi Bots. Lake Hub Foundation. Lake Hub was founded by James Odede, a young technology entrepreneur committed to bridging the technology gap that exists between Africa's big cities and rural areas. Lake Hub was set up as the first tech hub in Kisumu to accelerate the growth of social innovation in Western Kenya by providing young entrepreneurs, developers, and creatives in the region the resources they need to actively participate in the digital economy. Lake Hub Foundation have trained 250 youths annually in both their tech and entrepreneurship programs. For more information on Lake Hub Foundation, check the Funding with Trust website. Welcome back to our podcast, and we've got our guest on the line from Africa, the founder of Fundi Bots, based in Uganda. Welcome, Solomon, to the show.
Thank you so much, John. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, Eve was just telling me a little bit about Fundi Bots. How did you come up with the idea?
So this is actually a pretty interesting story. I started my journey as a very creative person. I was a very creative young person. I was the tinkerer that was always taking things apart. But when it came to the actual education system, I found that there was so much lacking for people like me.
Yes.
It was designed to shuffle people along from one class to the next. So my journey of experimentation and tinkering and passion was just not fit for the education system. So it was, through a series of frustrations that I had in my childhood that made me realize that we needed to create a space like this. And I thought to myself that I would eventually get around to doing it.
How long ago was that, Solomon?
Oh, it was the idea solidified when I was about 15. So basically 1996, 7.
And how many people do you think you've trained or brought up to speed with technology?
Currently, we've trained about 10,000 students, probably more, but the ones we've directly trained at 10,000.
So, Solomon, tell me why international NGOs didn't run with that great idea of teaching so many young people about technology.
One, because international NGOs tend to focus on lowest common denominator problems. So they'll basically be looking at healthcare. When it comes to education, they'll be looking at, what literacy and numeracy looks like. And for us, basically, our core focus is how do we make science more fun and more exciting. So international NGOs do not look at things like robotics because they're like, how does this play a role in the development of the African continent? Many local NGOs also very close to the problem. So we have the lived experiences. The most effective change makers are typically the ones who are solving a problem they or a family member have faced. The work that we do also requires a level of innovation on issues, and many INGOs do not have that structure that allows them to rapidly change or pivot or test ideas. They have convoluted processes, and smaller NGOs are just able to run with this. It's a really complex series of scenarios, but generally, it's easier for people like me to come up with an idea and say, you know what, I've experienced this, I've lived this, let me try as much as possible to solve it at the smallest scale possible.
So, Solomon, what you're saying is that smaller organizations and people like you would do this better than someone like John flying in from Australia into Africa and trying to study it?
I would say that we would be definitely more efficient at it.
You certainly would.
For example, John really hasn't grown with this problem, right? He may not understand the context and nuances that someone like me would have. And one of the really sad things, though, is that when it comes to this kind of work, when you're working with people and systems and communities, you need people who are truly invested.
Right.
So one of the challenges that you'd have with someone like John joining is that at some point, John is going to get homesick and he's going to leave the country. Or as we saw very, very recently, something like COVID will come up and John will say, I need to go back to my safe space. We had a recent issue where during COVID, where there so many people were afraid that there would be lots of dead bodies in the African streets because of our poor healthcare systems, that we had a lot of foreigners leaving the country. And when you're working and embedded in local communities, you have to be there to address challenges with the community. It has to be something that's core and essential to you. You have to have the mindset that this is my home and this is my people. So it's really about how the founder or the social entrepreneur is going to live within the community and solve the problem at a very grassroots level.
I take it all the people you've trained, Solomon, certainly aren't in Kampala. They're actually in outlying areas as well?
Yes. So the majority of the people that we trained are actually based outside of Kampala. Kampala, being the capital city, tends to have certain privileges, but we go very deep into the villages and communities to help the schools in there.
And are they able to access internet from all over Uganda?
No, internet penetration is really low in this country. So most of the internet in urban areas, in the cities and the towns. The rural areas might have some internet, but also internet comes at a cost, and many of them cannot afford the cost of internet.
And Solomon, too, I know some of our listeners could be wondering what the context you work in is like. So the kids that you're working with, how many of them would have interacted with computers before?
Let me put it this way. many of the teachers that we work with in rural areas have not used computers.
Oh,
So
is that it?
obviously, yes,
Wow.
obviously the kids also haven't. You're talking about communities that do not have electricity, where the idea of an internet-connected phone is it's exciting, but it's not really a thing.
Right.
We have what are called feature phones, which is basically a phone that can send an SMS, make phone calls, and that's it, And so those are the most prevalent phones that are available once you start traveling a lot more outside of the cities. So the chances of a child in a rural area having used a computer is very, very low. Even the schools that have computers have outdated computers that are barely functional and are only used within specific scenarios.
That would be very hard to imagine in some other contexts. For example, here in Australia, of course, somebody would not even relate to what you're saying, but it's a reality on ground, right?
It is. It's just the truth of what we do. If a very good example of how we always approach our work is that, yes, we are teaching kids how to build robots, but at the end of the day, how are we making this accessible to someone who does not know how to use a computer? And that is why our work is really exciting, because we are able to go into a community and start from the very basics. And that means that we're opening up a whole new world, not just in science and engineering, but in the use of technology to transform communities.
And what have some of your students gone on to develop? What kinds of robots or apps have they done?
So surprisingly, a lot of our students don't actually do robots. We have very little expectation of our students to actually go ahead and make robots. Within the classroom and training setting, we've seen students who have done experimental robots, to try and detect if there's like a gas leakage in a certain area. They've done school projects where they're building robots that can plant seeds. They've done messenger robots that, try and take a product from one place to another. And that is really exciting from the project angle. But what's really important to us is the opening up of their minds. When you are creating a robot, you are exploring so many disciplines and trying to figure out different ways in which the world works. And that unlocking creates a mindset of innovation, creates a mindset of possibility. It basically shows our students that even I can do this. And so many of them now have aspirations of becoming engineers. One of them wants to be a rocket scientist. Some of them want to be roboticists. But at the end of the day, what's really exciting for us is that they are saying, I can look at my community with a new lens and see problems that now I believe that I can solve. Whether or not they go on to solve it is really beyond us. What matters is that we've opened several doors, and it's really up to them to choose what they want to do next.
That is awesome, Solomon. I wish I had a similar opportunity growing up, but there was no Fundi Bots. So
I wish I had Fundi Bots when I was growing up.
Thank you so much, Solomon. But help me understand something here. Why is it then that most of the funding ends up going to international NGOs and not the local NGOs, if what you're saying is really true, that you're better placed to implement these solutions?
That's a really great question, Eve. And I want to use the example of a gentleman that I'm very familiar with who works in East Africa. So I'm an Ashoka Fellow. And Ashoka is basically a social entrepreneurship network that supports upcoming social entrepreneurs and helps provide for them the resources they need to start and continue their work. And they have fellows from all over the world. However, there are some fellows that they identify that are deep within the communities. And this guy's story is one that I like telling because it's a story of different levels of privilege. So this guy is working very deep in the community. He's helping literally thousands of people, but he's so far removed from the experience of fundraising and of donor engagement that he truly doesn't understand what all this is. So most of the time, you will find that the level of impact that someone like him is having is significantly more effective, more cost-effective. Unfortunately, because there's no way that donors can reach him, there's no way that donors understand the work that he's doing, it becomes very, very hard for him to raise the money. He doesn't know how to speak the language. He doesn't know how to communicate in a way that donors understand. So it becomes a very strong barrier between him and the person who wants to support his work. Many times, people like that are discovered accidentally. And then the second barrier comes into place. And this is the fact that people who have money tend to support or fund people that they can identify with.
Sure.
Right? And in many cases, this happens to be that the people with money are generally from the Western countries, from Australia, Europe, and the US, and they tend to look with more favor on people who look like them, and that's basically white people. So there's a very distinct barrier of trust, commitment, identity, etc., that makes it easier for someone who's just finished college in Australia, for example, to come into Uganda and say that they want to solve a problem in Africa. It's easier for that person to gain the resources they need because they are closer in trust, identity, and ethnicity to the person who's giving the money.
Wow, that's absolutely staggers me. I would have thought that some of the big philanthropic foundations would be so amenable to helping organisations such as yours. That's a surprise to me. Obviously not to you either, Eve.
Definitely. And John, something to even point out, Solomon is an Ashoka Fellow. Now, that's something really prestigious. And you would think anyone would come running and throwing funds at him.
Sure.
So, Solomon, you just talked about trust. And I wanted us to talk about that for a second here. So, why won't funders trust you if the likes of Ashoka have recognized your work and selected you to be a fellow? And you just told us that you have trained over 10,000 students. That's a very big number that would make heads turn. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and you've got a lot to show for your work, but why would they trust you?
So Ashoka is an example of a fellowship. Ashoka and Echoing Green are two fellowships that I've been privileged to be a part of. And these are fellowships that invest in the potential of the founder and the organization. So their trust is basically in saying, we believe that you have what it takes to change the community, the country, or the world that you live in. And so we want to invest in you as a person. So they're investing in the future of the person and the future of whatever work that they might do. So it's a lot of trust for them because for them, it's about what does the potential look like. Now, the organizations that tend to trust people like me are organizations that are very deliberate and intentional in supporting the work of locally led organizations, or the organizations that realize that they need to provide equitable support, right? Again, I'll always bring up the issue of, racial biases and all that. It's so much easier for someone who looks like someone else to get the funding that they need compared to, a more established veteran who's been working in the space. So we have trained tens of thousands of students. We've proven that our model works, but we always have questions coming up saying, yeah, but, the work that you're doing, how is it going to change the world, etc. There are just so many more barriers that we have to jump through to get the equivalent dollar value that someone else that's more closer to the funder would be able to get. So we can put in place a lot of systems and a lot of processes in order to reduce on those barriers, but there's still that inherent bias. And the inherent bias is once you're unable to overcome that inherent bias, there's no amount of convincing that will help to bring more funding into the space.
You've put it correctly, Solomon. The inherent bias issue is one that we can't ignore. How can funders recognize and overcome it?
I think one of the biggest challenges that funders need to do basically is one, to accept that there is an element of risk to the work that they're doing. A lot of the work that organizations like mine are doing are experimental. So the funders need to approach this with openness and empathy. One, empathy for the fact that organizations may not be at the level that they expect. They need to understand that they're operating in an environment that does not match anything that they may be used to. So once you start comparing someone's feedback or response or communication to something that you're used to, that's already a very strong mark of bias because you're making presumptions about how this person talks, how they communicate, the status of their work, the status of their organization. Another thing would be to extend a little bit more flexibility. Because for a lot of funders, their biggest concern is, am I actually giving my money to the right person?
Right.
And they trust someone who looks like them because it's just human nature, right? But we need to be able to accept the fact that we may not know who the right person is in this case. And it doesn't hurt to do your due diligence, etc. But remember that you are probably interacting with a person or a society or a community that you have no context or no understanding for. And so you need to trust the local people. You need to step away from the things that you know and try and learn as much as possible. The minute you find yourself becoming defensive to certain ideas and certain perspectives, then that's a good moment for you to step back and ask yourself a question. Am I looking at this from my lens, or am I giving the community the agency that it deserves as an independent entity? Yeah.
Solomon, can you give me an example of someone who would have been one of those people you've trained and how they've moved forward in the world of technology?
Well, John, I have a great story of someone who'd be a perfect example of what the impact of our work can be. He's a student who joined our program when he was in his senior 2, which probably puts him about 14, 13 years old. He was a student who absolutely hated sciences. He was not doing well in his school. So when he joined our program, he essentially started with the robotics program, got really excited about it, decided to become a robotics club president in his school, began rallying his fellow students to basically embrace the idea of science. They began a school club. And then when he did one of his intermediary examinations, which is an O-level examination, he actually performed really, really well in physics. And this was a subject that he absolutely hated and hadn't done well with. So over the years, we've seen him grow from someone who detested science to someone who started a foundation that's actually helping to raise awareness among young people about heart disease. And he recently got accepted to the African Leadership University in Rwanda. And he's doing a science-based course. Yeah.
Oh, Solomon, it must make you so proud to hear stories like that. And I'm guessing that this has been just one of many stories.
So, Solomon, when I visited, I've had a chance to visit Fundi Bots in Uganda. Something I observed when we went to one of the schools was that as soon as the students knew that the next lesson was a Fundi Bots taught class, they were all rushing and running. In fact, there were no chairs for the students. Why is that? Why is there such a rush for Fundi Bots classes?
Because it's fun.
Yes, exactly. That is precisely what it is. We bring fun to learning. We've all sat through science classes where we are memorizing equations, writing on the blackboard, and we are basically paying attention to someone standing at the front and telling us what to do and say. But when you bring purpose to learning, it becomes fun. It becomes exciting. You're no longer memorizing equations for the sake of memorizing them. You understand what they're needed for, and you're basically trying to solve a problem. And it's a very exciting experience.
Awesome. So, Solomon, one of the code words that donors use to justify not funding local organizations like yours is that they cannot effectively measure impact. Do you have any impact, and how do you measure that impact?
So in the beginning, we didn't have impact studies. Many donors like to use these impact studies as a measure of the success of your work. We didn't have impact studies, but we had anecdotal evidence. We had stories from teachers, students, and parents on how well their children were doing and how much more they loved science and how their performance was improving. Now, this is impact that makes sense for us. And it's impact that we can share. But many funders want to look at numbers. So now we carry out impact evaluations to see what data we can glean from our work. The impact evaluations are primarily for us to see what's working and what isn't. And sometimes it's a quick and instant evaluation, and other times it's longer and more drawn out. But we also use this to share the information with donors. But donors have to be more open-minded in how they look at impact. The biggest impact metric that donors want to see is something called a randomized control trial. And the budget for that alone can easily eclipse our organization's entire annual budget, right? So if you want the data that makes sense for donors, it becomes really expensive for us to prove that we are doing the work that we are doing, especially if you're a small organization.
Bit of a catch-22, isn't it, really?
It is.
Exactly. Exactly, which is why it's so frustrating. And so typically what we choose to do is prioritize the work, and then the impact evaluations can be done gradually over time instead of, yeah.
Right. So what you're saying really is that grassroots organizations actually have the impact, but not the kind of impact that donors want to see, the expensive impact.
It sounds to me like, Eve and Solomon, that the metric of being able to decide where money's going and the evaluation of such needs to be changed itself.
Definitely.
It needs to be changed. It also needs to be made more equitable. If you are giving an organization with a budget of $50,000, for example, or $100,000, then you cannot ask them to do an evaluation exercise that's going to cost the same amount of money.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't add up.
Be able to provide a level of equity. Yeah.
So Solomon, what would you be doing if you were not doing this? If you were not running Fundi Bots, where would Solomon be?
I would be an engineer working at the intersection of art and technology. Yes, I've always wanted to be an engineer, and I want to develop solutions to help move Africa forward.
And why aren't you doing that? Because you're running Fundi Bots, right?
It's another catch-22. I'm running Fundi Bots because I wasn't able to do that. And this goes back to the education system. I wanted to be a robotics engineer. There was no robotics in Uganda. I couldn't afford to go to MIT where I wanted to study. But then as I began pursuing alternate career paths, I realized that there were so many disillusioned children who are falling out of their hopes and dreams because the education system was failing them. So I decided that, let me pursue this idea that I had as a child to see if I can change the future for many more of Africa's children.
We need more Solomon King Benges in the world, don't we, Eve?
We do. If I had a bag of money.
We are making them.
I know.
You are making them. That's right. The people who are listening to this podcast wanted to know more about Solomon King Benge. Where would they go?
So you can find us on social media. We have a very strong social media presence. If you go to Fundi Bots on Twitter, Facebook, and under our site, you'll find a lot of information about us. Our website is www.fundibots.org.
So just to reiterate, it's Fundi Bots, which is FUNDIBOTS.org. That's the place to go. You'll find all about not just Fundi Bots, but also about Solomon King as well. That's an interesting name. How did that come about, Fundi?
So, John, Fundi is a Swahili word that means artisan, craftsman, tinkerer, basically someone who creates. In many Southern African countries, it also means a teacher or an expert. So it's a nice round definition of everything we hope to aspire to be.
Fundi Bots, FUNDIBOTS.org.
Solomon, thank you so much for your time. You just shared so many things that are enlightening and so many things that highlight the work and the importance of grassroots organizations. Thank you for your time, Solomon, and we hope to speak with you again soon.
Thank you, Eve. It was an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. And thank you, John, as well, for being a very awesome host.
What a wonderful man, Eve, and an incredible journey he's been on.
And he's got an incredible story, John. Do you agree with me?
Oh, totally. And I'm sure there's so many more tales in the future we're going to hear.
There is way more grassroots organizations doing an amazing job. We need to shine the spotlight on them. Everyone needs to know about the work that they're doing.
And that is what these podcasts will be all about. And they are going to live at fundingwithtrust.com. One word, fundingwithtrust.com. That's where you'll be able to hear and encourage others to leave comments and, most importantly, listen to these podcasts, because that's what it's all about, spreading the word, Eve.
Yeah, it is. And you can subscribe to Funding with Trust on Spotify, on iTunes, or on Google Play. And to support the organization that you just had, which is Fundi Bots, please visit our website at fundingwithtrust.com.
fundingwithtrust.com. I look forward to continuing this journey with you, Eve. It's a wonderful experience and a learning curve for me, I can assure you, and for all of our listeners.
Thank you, John. It is a pleasure.